Hello and welcome to the RCSI University of Medicine and Health Sciences. I'm Kieran O'Boyle, and today we're going to be discussing positive ageing and learning how to live well as we age. The panel discussion forms part of the RCSI's MyHealth Series. This series explores the wide range of areas in health and well-being and brings together some of the leading healthcare experts in these fields with the goal of empowering people with the knowledge to make informed decisions about their own health and well-being. Today I'm joined by Dr. Anya Ryan, postdoctoral fellow in professionalism in healthcare at RCSI. Anya is a chartered physiotherapist and an honorary lecturer in the School of Physiotherapy. We're also joined by Dr. Pádraig Dunn. Pádraig is an immunologist, practicing psychotherapist and meditation teacher at the RCSI Centre for Positive Psychology and Health. And we're also joined by Dr. Trudy Meehan, who's a lecturer at the RCSI Centre for Positive Psychology, a senior clinical psychologist, and who has worked in the area of psychiatry of later life. Welcome to the RCSI MyHealth Series. So tonight we're going to look at ageing and ask the question, how do we age well? People are obviously living longer. Life expectancy has increased for most of us. But for many of us the question is, how can we really improve the ways in which we age? Being elderly now is considered being over 80. So middle adulthood runs right up to that point. And many people have what we call a second adulthood. So we're really interested to find out how we can age as well as possible. So Trudy, can I turn to you first? And in your opinion, how do we define positive or successful aging?
It's a really great question, and I think one of the things we need to be careful of is to not overemphasize the positive, because we can put pressure on people as they age to have this very shiny version of life as being perfect. And life isn't like that. And I think successful aging is about having a continuity of self and a continuity of your life as you age. So you want to feel like yourself as you get older, and you want your life to resemble what it resembled throughout your life. And one of the things to highlight around that is a theory of aging that looks at selection, optimization, and compensation. And what do we mean by that? And an example of that is something that you've always enjoyed doing. For example, going shopping. As you age, you might need to adapt the way you do that, but you can do that through those mechanisms. So you might select your favorite shopping trip of the week. Maybe you can't do them all, but you select the one that works best and the one you prefer, and you keep that one. And then you do things to optimize that and to make that more likely to be successful. So if you have physio exercises to do or something that will help with, kind of keeping your mobility up, you do that so that you can optimize your experience. And then of course there's things like compensation. And that might be that, you can't do all the shopping trips, so you get the groceries delivered. And, you compensate in that way, or you might need a mobility aid to help you get to the shops. So the idea really, when we age successfully, is that there's a sense of continuity, but we have to do that by adapting how we do it. And our ability to adapt dictates whether we feel like we're successfully aging or not.
So a lot of that's in our own hands then, Trudy, and that's a very positive message that we can make choices. We'll come back to that in a bit. Pádraig, can we turn to what happens at the level of our cells when we age? Could you talk to us a little bit about this very interesting area of telomeres, and why are they important, especially in terms of how we age?
Sure, thanks very much, Kieran. So yeah, I think when we talk about aging on a cellular level, we have to start with the DNA before we move even into fancy terms like telomeres and telomerase. And really just as a recap for people out there, DNA really are the building blocks of life. So they code for all our genes. You'll find them within a little sac within each cell called a nucleus. And usually if we could peer inside a cell, we'd see DNA as two strands, like two shoelaces, wrapped very tightly around each other. Now, when that cell gets a signal to divide and multiplied into two individual daughter cells, that cell gets a signal to unravel the DNA. So then what you have is you have two DNA strands that begins to unravel. and they separate apart, and you can see this down a microscope, and it's quite a beautiful process. And you see the individual shoelaces or strands of DNA. And if we could zoom in further, what we'd see at the tips of the DNA are like little caps on the shoelaces. So little tips on the shoelaces, and they're called telomeres. Now, it turns out that every time a cell divides and the DNA is copied into a daughter cell, there's a chance of making a mistake at the end of the DNA. So we don't want to make mistakes in DNA, because if we make mistakes when we're copying, that could lead to a mutation, and that could lead to a cancerous cell. So all cells in our body have this built-in mechanism whereby, to protect the ends of the DNA from a mistake being copied into it and then into a daughter cell, these little caps protect the ends of the DNA. And these caps, which are also called telomeres, they don't code for any genes. So they're there. So in other words, if the cell machinery makes a mistake in copying, it doesn't matter. It doesn't code for anything. So that's the good news. So every cell in our body, we're born with a cap of a certain length. So imagine we could zoom further into the cap, and now we see the cap is actually composed of little beads. So let's say every cell in your body has 100 beads in it when you're born. Every time that cell divides, we lose one bead. A little bead gets cut off at the end. And eventually that cell will multiply, multiply, and multiply until it gets to the very last bead. And that's called the Hayflick limit. And that was coined by a scientist called Hayflick. And he noticed that when cells got to the very last bead of telomere length, the cell shut down. So it went into this process called senescence, which is really programmed sleep or programmed death. The reason being is, if we get any further, we're getting too close to coded DNA, which means if that cell divides, there's a chance it can mutate and become cancerous. So once we get to the very last bead, that's the end of the journey for the cell. It goes through programmed cell death. Usually the spleen or the liver wraps it up. So that's aging in a biological cellular level, and that's really the mechanism of our aging process in general, you know.
That's really interesting. So we've gone from what Trudy was talking about, is our kind of macro, the psychology aging, right down to the cellular level. And just, is there a link then, Pádraig, with our immune systems when this is happening?
Yeah, so really, as I said, all cells in our body, they have the telomeres at the end of DNA. We have a certain number of beads in terms of telomere beads, and when the cell divides, we lose one, and we get to that Hayflick number, and that's the end of that cell. However, there are a few cell types in the body that actually have a magic little robot in it called telomerase. And telomerase, for those of you who are interested in biochemistry, is called an enzyme, but it's really like a little molecular robot that goes inside the cell into the nucleus, and actually it can add back little beads. So let's say you've got only 12 beads left. Well, this little robot called telomerase can come in and start adding back beads, which means it's reversing aging. Now, the bad news is there are only a number of different cell types that actually have telomerase inside it, and one of those types are immune cells. The other cells are kind of male gametes, which are the sex cells that make spermatozoa, for example, or when an embryo is developing. So really what we're talking about here are immune cells have this little robot called telomerase in it. And the reason why you need to be able to lengthen telomerase, or to lengthen telomeres, I should say, in immune cells is, you can imagine if you get infected with COVID-19 today, and you have many different immune cells that react to that virus, and they multiply thousands of times. Well, if they multiply thousands of times and they reach their Hayflick limit, well, then you've lost all your immunity. So you need this little robot to come in to lengthen the life of your immune cells. Otherwise, vaccination wouldn't work. You'd have no immunity beyond probably your 21st birthday. So the immune system is crucial, but the immune system actually has a few tricks that the other cells in our body doesn't have, and that's telomerase.
That's really interesting. And we might come back in a while to talk about how our lifestyle and how we live our lives then affects this system at a cellular level. Thanks for that, Pádraig. So, Anya, moving on then from what Pádraig has just described there, can you tell us in a little bit more detail about what typically happens to our bones and our muscles then as we age?
Sure, thanks very much, Kieran. So, irrespective of our health status, as we age, our muscles and our bones age with us. And we know from about the age 50 that there is a 10% decline with each decade in our bone density and our bone strength, along with our flexibility. And we lose our muscle power that little bit faster, so we lose that at about 30% per decade, and that's accelerated after the age of 60. So in addition to this, we lose cartilage, that nice soft spongy cartilage in between our joints, which leads to that increase in stiffness, that reduced flexibility. And this can lead to things like reduced balance, reduced coordination, and stability. And that also has a knock-on effect that leaves adults and older adults at risk of falls, fractures, conditions like frailty, osteoporosis, osteoarthritis, and sarcopenia. So osteoporosis is when you have bones that are more fragile, that they're less dense, they're more prone to fracture. Sarcopenia then is the loss of muscle mass along with muscle function, which is a natural occurrence of aging, and that can vary in degrees of severity. So what would be important for people to be aware of is that it is a natural part of aging. Many factors can influence how we age and how our musculoskeletal system ages, and these can be things like genetics and our environment, as well as lifestyle factors. And that is why we can see a variation from person to person. One person might present with, a 70-year-old might present with mild stiffness, and another 70-year-old might present with severe arthritis, and that typically is to do with those factors that can influence these things.
That's really interesting, and we'll come on a little later talking about what we can do to prevent that or to slow that process. Now, another term, just when we're talking about aging, Anya, another term we hear a lot about is frailty. Now, what do we mean by frailty? What do you mean by frailty when you see frailty in an older person?
Frailty can be described as a loss of resilience. So let's say if someone has frailty, they won't bounce back as quickly from incidents such as mental or physical illness, from accidents, from life stressors, whereas the person without frailty will bounce back that bit quicker. In the literature, what we would look for when we're looking for frailty, as well as clinically, we're looking at things like weakness, slowness, fatigue, weight loss, and reduced physical activity. Frailty is typically more prevalent in women and in the community versus men. We know that those who are over 65, about 10% may have frailty, and then it progresses to 25 to 50% in those 85 or over. I think what's important for people to realise with frailty, again, is that it can vary in its severity and that it's not a static condition, and that there is really strong evidence now for tackling the physical component of frailty with things like exercise, along with diet and supplementation. Which
is very positive. So that means that we could come back from frailty.
Yeah.
And it's just going through my mind as you're speaking there, Anya, is that often sudden onset or is it a gradual onset for most people?
Typically it would be a gradual onset. It's not something that kind of happens overnight. It can be diagnosed in different ways. There's two kind of broad aspects around a phenotype of frailty versus the characteristics or presentations that I just mentioned.
Okay. So that means then we could see it starting to happen and actually intervene to do something about it. So we'll come back to how we intervene in a moment. Yeah.
I might just add that sometimes someone can present with frailty and then that might predispose them to other health conditions, and it can be the other way around in that you can have other health conditions that can predispose you to frailty.
Yeah, there's a linkage there. Excellent, thanks. So we'll come back around to that. So linking to that, Trudy, then, if we think about cognitive decline, or what happens to the way our brains work and how we function, what's your take on cognitive decline, and what do we need to be mindful of then as we age?
Yeah, it's a really important question. I think a lot of people have a huge fear around cognitive decline, and it's important to say that something like dementia isn't necessarily a natural process of aging. So it's important not to ignore signs and just, kind of say, oh, it's natural. It's not, and there's things that people can do to address that, and I'll come back to that. But the other thing, because of the fear around memory loss and decline in our thinking abilities, we can often add to the problem by worrying about it a lot. So it's important to put it in perspective and to say that there are losses and gains as our brain ages. Our processing speed slows down, but our ability to join the dots and see the bigger picture and complex thinking gets much better as we age. So it's important to appreciate the benefits and the changes that are good in an aging brain as well, because there's a lot of emphasis on the negative things. And we know that anxiety can cause what looks like memory impairment. and it can cause bottlenecks in our processing of attention and memory. So being stressed and worried can add to that. So it's important to look at things like stress management if you're worried about your memory. Going back to don't ignore it, because it's often seen as a very scary area, but a lot of the things that look like a dementing process are processes that are affecting your thinking that can be intervened into by a GP. So something like a urinary tract infection or a very bad chest infection in an older person could cause confusion and something that looks like a memory impairment, something like a B12 deficiency. So it's really important just to say to everybody not to ignore these things, because a lot of them can be addressed with very simple intervention. And even if it is a dementing process and a kind of more serious disease process, it's still really important to address it. And there are things that can be put in place to slow down the process. And depending on the type of dementia, the presentation and the causes of it, something like a vascular dementia, which can be caused by a series of mini strokes, you can look at the person's heart health and cholesterol levels and things like that the disease process will indicate that need to be addressed. So it's important to go to somebody and have a good assessment and not to be scared of it.
That's really interesting, because a lot of people worry when their memory starts to, or they start to forget things, and it might be nothing to do with dementia. It could be anxiety or even a urinary tract infection. So it's really important to have a differential diagnosis there. And then Trudy, the kinds of things that Pádraig and Anya have been talking about then as cellular changes and changes in our musculature, and can that have an effect on our cognitive aging?
Yeah, we know, and Pádraig would be able to speak more to this, but we know that processes like inflammation have an impact on our brain. So lifestyle factors and especially diet impact on our brain health. And we know that that's important to look at throughout your lifespan. So that's a longer term picture, and looking at addressing your brain health throughout the course of your lifespan. And that's really important. Then things like exercise to increase your circulation and your heart health are very important for your brain as well. But we know that on a broader level, some positive psychology interventions, things like meaning and purpose, can have an impact on your brain. And there's really interesting work by Patricia Boyle looking at purpose and meaning and the aging brain. And what she's found is that for people who have purpose and a sense that what they're doing in life is meaningful, what it seems to be doing is building up a cognitive reserve. So when you engage in meaningful activity, you're creating connections in your brain. And that essentially is creating a denser brain with more connections. And the theory at the moment is that those denser, more connected brains are providing a reserve of healthy brain, so that when a disease process starts to take place, there's a healthy brain reserve to promote and preserve cognitive function. And so we can do a lot by engaging in activities that are meaningful to us. And that's a really exciting area of research, because on one side we're looking at preventing the plaques and tangles that you would see in a diseased brain. But what Patricia Boyle's work is saying, that even if you can't prevent that, on the other side of that you can have a reserve that when the plaques and tangles appear, you're not seeing a dementing process taking place in terms of the cognitive impact. And that's really exciting, because you can attack it on both fronts in terms of lifestyle, diet and exercise, but also the softer things like purpose and meaning.
That's very interesting. And purpose and meaning, of course, is hugely important. Prevention of depression and so on as we get older. We might come back around to that. We'll talk later about blue zones and where people live very long lives. So thanks for that, Trudy. So Pádraig, if we come back, then we're again looking at the strategies we can use to live well. And you've showed us how our telomeres are really important to our cell health and to cell decline. Are there things we can do then to protect our telomeres at that cellular level?
Yeah, absolutely, and there's a lot of research emerging over the last 20 years on this. I should introduce one caveat though in terms of the research. So when most researchers are looking at cells that have telomeres in it and measuring telomere length, they're going for the low-hanging fruit in terms of our peripheral blood, because it's much harder to get in and look at our liver or our gut or spleen or other different organs and things like that, or even into our bone for that matter. So what researchers tend to do is go for that low-hanging fruit, which peripheral cells in our blood, which is fine, and I did research like that many years ago myself. But what that means is that when we talk about research on telomere length, we're really talking about looking at telomere length in immune cells in peripheral blood. Now, there is certainly a link, but we can't say for definite that, X equals Y here. But what the research, generally speaking, shows, and anybody who watches the MyHealth series will be familiar with the pillars of lifestyle medicine. Yes. We say it again and again, and we say it for a reason, because the research shows again and again that these things have multiple positive effects. And when we look at activities that we can all engage in that actually seem to lengthen the length of our telomeres in cells, we're talking about exercise, vigorous exercise. Now, you don't have to go and join a gym, but we're talking about moderate to vigorous exercise, 20 minutes a day, 5 days a week. So there's a number of research papers that show that. We're also talking about relatively healthy diet, predominantly plant-based diet. Red meat says that it seems to have a negative impact on telomere length. And the reason behind that, the thinking is that red meat tends to induce a kind of a low-level inflammation. So it seems to have an indirect impact on telomere length because of that. So if you bump up the fruit and veg, fresh fruit and veg, if you can get it, and just bring the meat down a little bit, then you can actually lengthen your telomeres, and that's pretty impressive. So there are positive things you can do. The other thing, and Trudy mentioned this as well, is stress has a massive impact on shortening telomeres and inhibiting the little robot telomerase. So that means the converse is true. If you can practice simple stress management techniques, and we've talked about them throughout the MyHealth series, you can have a big impact on actually, you're not going to find the elixir of life, but you can actually prevent premature shortening of telomeres. And actually some studies have shown that practices like meditation, believe it or not, can actually bump up the activity of telomerase and actually lengthen telomere length in immune cells.
So Park, thinking about our telomeres, what are the kinds of behaviours that we engage in that are bad for our telomeres?
Yeah, so I think, number one on the list is smoking, without a doubt. So smoking has a serious impact on the length of our telomeres. It accelerates shortening, and it inhibits that robot, again, telomerase. Stress does have a negative impact. Other drugs, like more harsh drugs, do have an impact on telomere length as well. However, the jury's out with alcohol, whether it has a positive or negative impact as of yet.
Thanks for that part. Anya, so the same question arises there. What can we do then to maintain our muscle health and our bone health as we age? I think exercise is going to figure here as well, isn't it?
Yes, it is. So that exercise can slow the rate of how we lose our bone. It also can make our bone stronger. So incorporating things like walking and weight-bearing exercise in general, but making sure that you're doing something that you enjoy when you're thinking about physical activity, first and foremost, and exercise. And also one tip for viewers also would be to break up the amount of time you sit. We know that sedentary lifestyles are associated with poorer health outcomes, and it's just the environments that we live in nowadays that we're all sitting for longer. So to think about breaking up the amount of time you spend sitting per day, and also kind of think about your routines and your habits around physical activity. Can you get off the bus one stop earlier? Can you take the stairs and that's your go-to habit as opposed to taking a lift? Things like that can really make a difference over the long term, and that consistency is key.
That's very interesting. I've got myself one of these desks that I can rise up and down, and for the last 2 months I'm finding it make an amazing difference because I'm spending more time standing. Yeah. And it's really seeing the research about how bad continuous sitting is for us that made me do that. It's not too late for me. But
no, it's definitely not too late. It's never too late. It's never too late. And it's never too
any
little.
Exercise, Anya, is better than
100%.
Doing anything is better.
Some is better than none. And trying to find something you enjoy is so important, because when you enjoy something, you'll be consistent with it.
Yes, you're more likely to do it. Great, we'll come back around. So we've heard a bit about, what we can do there, but, in general, particularly in our societies, Trudy, aging gets a kind of a bad rap. There's a lot of stigma around aging, and we hear about ageism and so on. How do we combat the negativity that's associated with aging? How do we promote positive aging?
I think the thing to say is that it's everybody's responsibility, because we're all aging all the time. So it's something that we should all care about. And we know that a person's ability to thrive is dependent on how much in harmony we are with our environment and our relationships. So to thrive as we get older depends not just on who we are and our personality and our adaptability, but also on how the environment and the relationships we're in receive us as we age. So it's important to hold on to, to have value for older people and roles for older people, and to have policies in place to support that. And also to allow older people to age in place, and ageing at home is really important, and to have funding and processes in place for that. But it's also important to remember that older people make a massive contribution. So if we look at TILDA, the Irish longitudinal study of ageing, they've surveyed a lot of older adults in Ireland, and we can see from their results that actually older adults are net contributors to their families and society at large. So they're contributing to their families in terms of contributing financially, contributing in terms of social support and childcare, but also a lot of older adults still have living parents who they're looking after and caring for as well. So they're contributing to that generation. So there's a lot of intergenerational transfer of care, finances, knowledge and wisdom that we really need to acknowledge. And the other thing is that a lot of older people in Ireland volunteer and contribute to society outside of their family situations. About half of older people volunteer during the year, but about 17% volunteer on a weekly basis. And it's around making space for that and having opportunities for participation for older people, and to redefine how we participate outside of the working week. How else can we participate and have meaningful contributions?
Yeah, that's really positive. We should need to shout more about that, about the contribution of older people to our societies, and that is the case in other societies where it's more recognised that the contribution that older people make.
Definitely, and I think we do need to shout more about it, because we have a wonderful strategy on positive ageing, but the thing is the strategy is not backed up by legislation or funding, so there isn't often follow through. So I think everybody should be asking, when elected representatives come to your door, ask them about the strategy on positive ageing. Do they know about it, and what are the concrete steps they're taking to put that into action? Because we need to be supported. We have to have, and that thing around having opportunities to age well, that's given to us by our society and by the environment we live in, and it's not just based on our ability to adapt.
And that brings us this really interesting question, Pádraig, if I can turn to you, about these areas in the world where people just naturally live very long, I think sometimes up into their hundreds, called these blue zones. So can you tell us a bit about what these blue zones are?
Yeah, that's right, Kieran. So fascinating areas. And about I think it's about 20 years ago that the television company National Geographic got together with a number of scientists and journalists, and one of the journalists is called Dan Buettner. And they had this very simple question: where do people live on Earth the longest? Fairly simple question. And they looked through a lot of the records, and they came up with initially 5 zones on Earth where people live the longest. Okay, so they found the 5 zones, and they circled these zones on a map with a blue marker, hence blue zones. And they said, okay, well, let's go and find out if these guys have anything in common. You know, have they found the elixir of life, or is it actually quite simple? So they literally traveled to these places and studied these places, these 5 places, over a number of years. And the 5 places, very briefly, if we go from left to right across the Earth, we're talking about a town called Loma Linda in California in the US. We're talking about the Nicoya Peninsula in Costa Rica, Central America. Zip across the Atlantic, we're going to the Mediterranean, and the first place we hit is Sardinia, specifically the Nuoro province of Sardinia. Then across the Mediterranean again to the island of Ikaria in Greece, and then finally over to Okinawa island off Japan. So very different regions, very different countries, very different cultural backgrounds. What have they all got in common? So when you put it all together, now they do have obviously cultural differences and differences in eating patterns and things like that, but when you break it down to its simplest level, and I'm going to be at risk of boring everybody now by saying this again, because we're going to repeat what Trudy said and what Anya said, which is really all about the pillars of lifestyle medicine again. What did these people find? Surprise, surprise. These people eat predominantly plant-based diets that are rich in fruit and vegetables, high in legumes, so beans and peas, high in nuts, low percentages of meat, poultry and fish, so 5% or less, depending on which country they're in. They don't tend to consume a lot of dairy. So if they're going to take in dairy, it's usually goat milk, especially in the Mediterranean, which is interesting. But for me, the more interesting things, what else do they do? They engage in natural movement. So household chores are really important. Walking to the shops, carrying your own shopping, no matter how old you are. And as you rightly said, Kieran, we're talking about living to 100 and longer. Twice the amount of people living to 100 and longer. And not just living to 100, but to 100 with quality. That's the key here. But what else do they have? They've got a very strong sense of meaning and purpose, which is what Trudy was talking about earlier. A very strong presence in the community, greatly respected. If in Okinawa, if you're a mechanic when you're 19, you're a mechanic when you're 95. You just don't work as hard, and you're respected in the community. So these are all really the pillars of lifestyle medicine, again, really practiced in real life, which shows you if we can engage in these practices, which is a very positive message, we can live, if we're lucky enough, to be 100 and older.
That's great. And we really do have to create the environments that will help people to do that. So thanks for that, Pádraig. So for people watching then, we're going to look at what the take-home messages are from this session. So Anya, can I start with you? What would your take-home message be for us in terms of ageing well?
Yeah, what I'd like viewers to take away from, I suppose, what I've brought to the table this evening would be the 3 Bs. To be active, to build your balance and your strength, and to break up your time sitting. And just to break that down, being active, thinking about your day, your routine, thinking about how you can incorporate it, that it's a habit, that it's not a chore. And also with regards breaking up your time sitting, that marries very well with that. And also the 3rd B, building balance and strength. We can look at building balance through things like Tai Chi, bowls, dancing, building our strength through things, if you enjoy going to the gym, carrying groceries, yoga. Those are the 3 take-home messages that I'd like viewers to take away today.
That's really interesting. So it's use it or lose it, kind of. It's better to keep using it.
For sure. And at any age, you can commence doing those things. If you're very sedentary or the guidelines seem too far from your reach, don't let that put you off, because the evidence and the research has told us that even incremental small bouts of activity can have a really significant impact.
That's really important. So it's never too late to start on it.
No.
Okay, thanks for that. Trudy, can I ask you the same question? What are your take-home messages for us in relation to ageing well?
Yeah, I think 2 things, if I may. One is to avoid the graveyard of regret. And, ageing can be a time of reflecting and looking back. But we know from the Harvard longitudinal study of ageing, one of the things that people who age well do is that they're able to let go of things and to be able to move on and focus on the here and now and not spend too much time reflecting on the smaller details and the things that have went wrong in the past. So that's really important, and it's a difficult thing to do, but it's really beneficial if we can do that. And then the last thing I'd say is that ageing is about gains and losses. And it's around reflecting on those and having that balance and the idea of healing versus cure. We may not be able to cure all the diseases that happen as we age and throughout our lives, but we can still experience a sense of well-being despite having perhaps an illness or infirmity. And it's really important to hold that idea. And I just love that idea of being able to experience healing right up until the point of death. So we can experience healing. And I think that's a really important thing to remember, that even when we're suffering, there can be a sense of healing.
And we can have quality of life even if we're suffering and we are dealing with a chronic illness. It's a great term, that, the graveyard of regret. A certain amount of that perhaps inevitable, but we've got to be careful to control that. Yeah. Okay, thanks for that, Judy. And Pádraig, finally, the same question to you. What's your take-home message for people who are watching?
Yeah, I think two things, Kieran. First is I'm going to steal a phrase from the American journalist Michael Pollan, and it really kind of summarizes much of the blue zones, which is eat less, mostly plants. I think it's a beautiful, simple statement that I certainly should adhere to more. I think if we all do, the research shows that we live a bit longer with quality. And then the second thing is cultivate meaning and purpose through activities like creativity and engaging with our communities. You don't have to be Michelangelo. You can make 3-legged stools in the local men's shed, but get out into your communities, be active in your community, and start early. Don't wait until you retire, you know, because for me, there should be a positive message about aging, not a negative one. I think there's been too much of a negative one for too long. So that's why hopefully everybody will take a more positive view of aging from this, you know.
Yeah. And of course that's been difficult for people to do. We're in the middle of a pandemic, but it's still possible to be creative and to still keep the links. Thanks very much for that, Pádraig. So that concludes our discussion for today on positive aging and aging well. And my thanks to our 3 experts, Dr. Trudy Meehan, Dr. Pádraig Dunn, and Dr. Anya Ryan. So the next event in the MyHealth series will focus on living well through perimenopause and menopause. And further details about this and all of the other upcoming events in the RCSI MyHealth series can be found on the website. So from all of us at the RCSI University of Medicine and Health Sciences, thank you for watching and stay safe.